Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening. I'm Janet Abbott, and along with working as the Visitor Host Supervisor at the Christchurch Art Gallery in the weekends, I'm currently studying Cecil and Elizabeth there, Kelly, who are two painters in Christchurch from 1900 to 1950 roughly. And to do that, I've had to look at the Christchurch art scene, the Canterbury art scene, that was quite vibrant at that time. Tonight, I'd like to start by proposing that Christchurch and Canterbury was the centre of art in New Zealand for this period, from 1900 to 1950. Before that, perhaps Dunedin. After that, Auckland. But in that interim period where some very exciting things happened, I believe that it was a vibrant art scene in Christchurch. And my two painters, Cecil and Elizabeth Kelly, they were a married couple, whose careers span this period, were an integral part of that exciting scene. For those of you who don't know Elizabeth yet, she was a portrait painter and landscape painter in Christchurch. And she showed at the Royal Academy in London. She won silver medals at the Salon in Paris, and ultimately got CBE for her art in New Zealand. And you know, people like Sydney Thompson and Archibald Nicholl got OBEs, which was lower. Her husband, together they painted landscape. I went out into the landscape and painted, as you've already seen a little bit of. And Cecil taught the landscape class and other classes at the Canterbury College School of Art in Christchurch for 40 years. So he taught some of those vital artists that we're going to look at along the way. So first of all, I'm going to talk about, or still a bit of overview, but I'm going to talk about some of the, what we call this, we call Elizabeth, Cecil, Archibald Nicholl, Sydney Thompson, the first generation of Canterbury regional landscape painters. And people like Rita Angus, Bill Sutton, and all that crowd are the second generation. They're taught by this generation. So we've sort of got two generations of art that's happening there, particularly in the field of landscape painting. New Zealand art history has been written largely from a northern perspective. So most of the books on art history, those ones, are written by people in Auckland. So Gordon Brown, Hamish Keith, Michael Dunn, Gil Docking, all great work, but done with a particular bias. Often using art examples from the Auckland City Art Gallery. The narrative that they've formed follows a story of discovery, mapping the land, overseas artists coming to New Zealand, painting the picturesque in Splime and Milford Sound and such like, and painting the landscape in a European way, and then developing a national regional style which centred around Christopher Perkins' work of Mount Taranaki and Rita Angus's Cass. From there they go on to Colin McCann, Toss Williston, Louise Henderson, and the others that took New Zealand into the modern era, the modernism. What appears to be missing from this narrative is certain key developments that happened in Canterbury from 1900 to 1950, and that's resulted in some missing chapters which I intend to remediate about the Canterbury College School of Art itself, which was kind of the hub of the Canterbury regional landscape painters. A lot of them were teachers there or had been pupils there. New Zealand Impressionism, which is an interesting thing because we don't talk much about New Zealand Impressionism. I mean, the Aussies just love their, you know, Heidelberg School of, and you know, you get little Australian Impressionist works that are on the top of a cigar box, 9 inches by 5 or something like that, and they sell for $250,000 Aussie dollars. So other people do appreciate their Impressionism, we don't. And the other thing that's missing, which I'm really filling up the gap for, is the Kelly's art and their influence. So we're going to address some of these tonight. Without these developments, we would not have had the artists who came out of the School of Art and began practicing in the late 1920s and 30s. It's a long list, but I've picked out a few of the women who came through the School of Art while Cecil was teaching there, because A, I like talking about women artists, and B, they don't get much airtime sometimes, and also because, we've got the Zonta thing going on, haven't we? Bit of a theme going on here. And it's really important to encourage our women artists, because they stand against barriers that even today they're probably still bringing in the washing. Anyway, said enough of that. So we're going to start with our favourite New Zealand regional artist here, but she is the second generation of regional painters. Just keep that in mind. And I haven't given her dates. She was 1908 to 1970. She was born in Hastings and went to school in Palmerston North. And when she showed some talent at school, her teacher recommended that she came to Christchurch to go to the School of Art. Such was its reputation. And that's the thing about art schools. You don't necessarily, dare I say it, I used to run the art program at the Design Arts College in Christchurch. You don't necessarily have to teach well all the time, but you do have to, once you get a school of art gets a certain momentum, they attract talent, people that can draw like angels when they arrive. And then you promote that in a certain way. And what happened, there was a kind of a vibe going on in Christchurch that allowed women to flourish. And one of my sort of thoughts in the back of my mind is that Cecil's there teaching them landscape art, and he's also saying, oh, you know, and by the way, you know, Elizabeth's just got a silver medal at the salon, and you know, she's just got the CBE, and she's just got this work in the show, and she's just done this, that, and the other thing. So they provided an example of a woman in Christchurch through 2 world wars and depression, etc., and the Spanish flu, and goodness only knows what, who created a professional career within those boundaries, within those circumstances. Anyway, back to Rita. She had tutors such as Leonard Booth, Cecil Kelly, Archibald Nichol, Richard Warwick, and she received that sound training in life drawing, still life, and landscape painting. Art history lectures introduced her to what would be an enduring interest in the Renaissance and medieval art. In 1930, she married Alfred Cook, and you'll notice down in the corner there, it's actually signed Rita Cook. That's what happens to some of her paintings. There's a period there. She separated, you know, Mrs. Cook, the mother-in-law, took her out of art school to do the washing on Thursdays because she had this huge family of boys and she expected Rita to help, and it didn't suit Rita, so the marriage sort of got dissolved on the basis of those sorts of things. Anyway, and Rita also used the name Mackenzie after Cook, who was an aunt that she had, so that signature turns up as well. Most assigned Rita Angus, and she went back to Angus eventually. This is one of the 55 self-portraits she painted, and it shows her as a confident modern woman in an urban environment. At the time, she had a room in Sydney Thompson's house on Cambridge Terrace, and she was working with Leo Benseman and Lawrence Bagent. And she went on to paint Betty Curnow, you might know these ones. When she was, during the war, she was manpowered into essential work, and she was working in scallops, and it really didn't suit her. She really wasn't coping very well. So Betty Curnow got her as a housekeeper. As you can see, she didn't do much dusting. she was busy painting. But that's good, you know, because Betty Curnow was married to Alan Curnow, who was the writer, and they had Winston Curnow, who was 2 years old at this time, and she's pregnant with another child there. And those are Winston's little blue trousers there. I could spend the evening on this because we had an amazing Rita Angus symposium down in Dunedin one year, many years ago. And Betty Curnow was there, smoking, whipping out to have a fag at the break and that sort of thing. And that was unfortunate because some poor young man from Auckland had decided to talk about this painting. And there's Betty sitting like there, and she got right of reply, and she had a few things to say, I tell you. So we found out the truth about this painting. Anyway, one of the icons of New Zealand art, done by a woman. Here we go. And of course the goddess series. So there's about 3 goddesses, and this is Rutu. Could spend a while on that. She lived on Clifton Hill for a while, and in 1955 she moved to Wellington, taking trips to visit her parents in Napier, and she's regarded as one of the leading figures in 20th century New Zealand art. Moving on to another person that's come out of this art school, come out of this kind of little hothouse that we had in Christchurch, Louise Henderson. She was born in Paris, and her father was secretary to Rodin, and as a child she would sit and play with chips of marble on the floor while her father talked to Rodin. She wanted to be a painter, but her parents were against it. They didn't think that was a good thing for a girl to do. So she studied design and embroidery in Paris. But she met a Kiwi husband, a Kiwi who became her husband, Hubert Henderson, and married him out here in 1925. In Christchurch, as a married woman, she enrolled at the Canterbury College School of Art in 1926, and she also taught embroidery there and design as well. She actually taught my mother there. The Canterbury College School of Art actually had a high school as well, and so my mum went there in 1939 as a 12-year-old, sort of a third former, what do you call it, year something or other these days, it's 9. And the idea was that these people would go in as a high school, and she said you didn't learn much English or maths, but you certainly got a lot of designing embroidery, and they'd actually get like a plant from the Botanic Gardens, draw it for the morning, and then they'd turn that into a design for embroidery. And Louise Henderson, they called her Madame Henderson, she had the most exciting fashion items, clothing that the girls were excited about. Anyway, she taught there, but kind of the women were teaching the junior classes. Rightly fearing World War II, her parents emigrated to Christchurch in 1936. So she got a babysitter in 1936. This year here, she was able to go up to the biological field station at Cass with Rita Angus, and did these sorts of paintings up there. So that's a contemporary work with Cass, same year, same place, same time. They're working together. Those of you who came to the CAG Christchurch Art Gallery Louise Henderson exhibition will know that she developed a little bit more into modernism, and much of the rest of the career was doing things like cubism. In actual fact, I believe she brought cubism to New Zealand because she actually was French, she spoke French. She could read the texts on cubism in French before they were translated into English. Colin McCann is largely, with his Kauri paintings, considered to be the person that brings cubism to New Zealand, but it was Louise, in my opinion. This is all about Janet's opinion today. And she continued to paint in a more abstract way into her 90s, and there were the 12 huge month paintings that she was painted when she was 85 years old, and we've currently got a couple out, I think, if you come to Christchurch. Other people include, there's Louise Henderson up at Arthur's Pass in 1940, and you can see at this stage she still is quite, this is the style she was taught, but she developed out of that and went on to, develop a much more modern style, or very different modern styles. Rata Lovell-Smith, she was Rata Bird at the time, and she was educated at Girls' High and trained as a primary teacher. She studied at the Canterbury College School of Art from 1911 to 12, and then from 1917 to 1923, so quite early in the century. And again, she studied under Booth, Kelly, Warwick, all those teachers were teaching her there. She was there with students like Rita Angus, Nio Marsh and Rhona Haszard, and she married Colin Lovell-Smith in 1922, who was also there, and he was more kind of a graphic designer. She and Colin, so another artist couple going out into the landscape to paint. A woman couldn't go into the landscape to paint on her own. She had to have a companion of some sort. So she's painted Hawkins here in 1932, and that certain reductive quality about it, and it's considered to be one of the second generation of regionalist painters. And you'll note that it's like 4 years before Cass, and a little bit before Christopher Perkins as well, I would suggest. And it was the one that when I did art history at Canterbury, always turned up in the slide test because it doesn't have like Cass written on the station there. You had to work out what it was. Olivia Spencer-Bauer, another one of these amazing artists that come out of this period. She was born in Britain 20 minutes after her twin Marmaduke in 1905. And her mother was Rosa Dixon, who was an artist from Canterbury. So her mother sort of went to Britain, got married to sort of an older man, had the twins, and then when Rosa's husband retired, they came back to New Zealand, and Marmaduke took over the farm up in at the hills. Can't remember which hills, but up from Christchurch there somewhere. After Rangiruru, Olivia went to the Canterbury College School of Art, graduating at the age of 24. She went to Britain and studied at the Slade School of Fine Art, and she specialised in watercolour painted here and abroad. And she supported herself throughout her life, never married, with her painting. She said things like watercolour is a medium that is unforgiving. Once you put that colour down on the paper, there's no going back. It's not like oil. You can't like go over it or take it off or anything. It's, so you have to know what you're doing. And she also, I think it was her that talks about, being up there in the mountains around sort of on the way to Arthur's Pass, and she is dipping her watercolour brush into the stream for water. I think that's really nice. So some of those have actually got like stream water as their water for the watercolour. Nio Marsh, you might know from her writing. She needs little introduction. As well as being a gifted writer and passionate thespian, she attended the Canterbury College School of Art and thought she was going to be an artist. And she was a good painter. She was a lifelong friend of Eve Page and Olivia Spencer-Bauer, and she earned her living as a writer, never married. And you can see a number of her paintings at the Nio Marsh house on Cashmere Hill if you ever, you can kind of, I think they have people up there on Tuesdays and you can book into there as well. And here's Eve Page. Evelyn Page Paulson enrolled at the Canterbury College School of Art when she was 15 as a secondary school student, and she was also involved in musical circles and married to Frederick Page, who was a musician in Christchurch. They moved to Wellington after Fred was appointed as a lecturer to the and established the music department at Victoria University. And she's well known for a series of nudes that she not only made in Christchurch, but also when they had their house in Waikanae, so on the Kapiti coast there, she had a cleaner, and the cleaner modelled for her, but on the condition that her face was never shown and her mother would never know. Eve and one of the other women used to go up into the kind of the hills of the Port Hills around Christchurch, and and strip off and paint each other because, you know, they just needed a model. But there are stories about them surprising some young shepherds who stumbled across them. Anyway, this work is in the collection of the Christchurch Art Gallery, not on display at the moment. And we had to take it off show and take away all the reproductions while this woman here was still alive, because that was the agreement. It would never be shown in public while she was alive. And we didn't always follow that instruction. Anyway, she is no longer with us, so we can show it now. And the person in the boat in the pink dress down the back there is actually a man. She needed someone else to balance the composition. And so someone's husband was lurking around, so he got put in a pink dress, which is arguably not done up down the back, and had to pose there with the, looking at, anyway, there you go. And another one, just keep going, don't I? I could keep going all night. Rhona Haszard led a hazardous life. She was another talented student who came from around the country to be an art student in Christchurch, and she's seen as a pioneer of modernism. She embraced a certain bohemian freedom by marrying first artist Roland Mackenzie in 1922, and then the rather more exciting Henry Greener in 1925. So there was divorce involved in Christchurch in 1920 something or other, and a huge scandal. And you just didn't put your foot wrong in Canterbury society. And back in the day, your reputation was as a woman was paramount. And anyway, Rhona travelled overseas, and they travelled to Brittany and Sark, one of the Channel Islands, where Henry Greener's parents lived. And they did a tour through the biking tour through the Valley of the Marne, and the patchwork colours in these works and the high viewpoints make these some of the classic works of her post-impressionist style. Her life ended tragically with a fall from a tower in Alexandra, and she was just 30. And where this jury's still out was like, did she jump? Was she pushed? Did she fall? You know, we don't know. And we never will. But there's a certain amount of intrigue, and that's one of my favourite. That's the road to Little Sark on the Channel Islands. And I mean, if the colours were true, I mean, just love those sort of greens and these trees that look like they're like little Art Nouveau things. There's kind of a quality about it that it's absolutely delightful. And her husband, Henry Greener, brought a whole collection of her work back after she died and toured it through New Zealand, and it got bought up and has turned up in the galleries around New Zealand, various collections around New Zealand. So that was a bit of a shame. Grace Butler, another one. Back home, she married Guy Butler. She was knee coming, and attended the Canterbury College School of Art from 1910 to 1914. She lived in New Brighton, as you can see here, and she had Jack's hut in Arthur's Pass. You might know that the autobiography, Jack's Hut. It's great stories about the coaching route that was over Arthur's Pass before they finished off the Aotearoa tunnel. There's another great story about, paragraph about the coaching route over that in Ngaio Marsh's Black Beech and Honeydew. Anyway, she painted the beach in Christchurch and the bush in Arthur's Pass, and she particularly noted, particularly noted kind of how the New Zealand bush has a lot of red in the leaves when you're painting the bush. Keep an eye out for that. And just to balance it off, I put Bill Sutton in here. Bill Sutton attended Boys High and then the Canterbury College School of Art from 1934 to 1938. And careers were a little bit more straightforward for the men, and he began as a junior teacher in 1939 and taught there from then till 1979. And during World War II, he was part of the Home Force in the New Zealand Army, and he used his painting skills so well He actually literally painted the landscape. So they set him a task. There was a runway where planes were landing, and they wanted it camouflaged in case the enemy came. So he painted like hedgerow down the middle of it and field, grass and that sort of thing so well that our pilots couldn't land. They couldn't find the airstrip. Anyway, he's best known for his Canterbury landscapes, and they're quintessential Canterbury landscapes, and this is this regional painting again, second generation, a little bit more stylised, and you can tell it's a Norwest day. And there we are, Norwester in the Cemetery. That's an Auckland Art Gallery work. And he uses a composite way of painting, so he brings things together, like that's a cemetery in the countryside, but that little chapel was in the Barbados Street Cemetery before they put the one-way system through the middle of it and had to move it. And he's moved, trees around and such like. So Rita Angus does that as well. Composite paintings, taking things from different places and putting them where it suits your composition. The first generation of landscape painters, Canterbury landscape painters, painted Impressionism. They sat in front of that landscape. They maybe, if it was a big one, they might have like penciled it in the shape of the hills the day before, and then they came back like at sunrise or like sunset or a particular time of day, and they got that on the canvas in that time, straight on the canvas, what they saw in front of them. Bill Sutton, he has the big studio in his house, and he goes out and sketches in the landscape generally. I mean, he does also paint in the watercolours in the landscape and things like that. There's a film of him doing that, but not so, steadfast about painting en plein air. So there are also women that we're just finding out about, women who went to the art school and then travelled overseas and stayed overseas and had full careers that we don't even know about. So Eleanor Hughes, for instance, Ken talked about her last year, and I won't go into it, but she had a full career down in Cornwall, on the south coast of Cornwall, anyway, near Land's End there, and had a full career, married another painter, painting couple, did that, and then we've got Roberta Cameron Smith, who, this is a painting by Elizabeth Kelly of Roberta as a young girl, and the Kellys quite often, they never had any children of their own, but they quite liked young company, and she was one of their proteges. She was at the School of Art, and she, went to the CSA openings with them and that sort of thing. She went overseas and she married Leon Villencoeur, and her style of art, this is kind of one of hers, it's kind of a surreal painting, as you can kind of see. She's sort of painting the landscape in front of you. It's kind of like a, who's that, Belgian surrealist, anyway, Marguerite work. We're kind of seeing the painting of the landscape, of the, in the landscape, as it were. Yeah. Anyway, so we've got more women to find, because once they go overseas, marry someone, change their names, they're really hard to track down. Other women went to the art school and taught at high schools around the place. So Florence Aiken taught for many years at the art school. Christabel Atkin carved the lions on the Bridge of Remembrance, and she carved for the 1940 Centennial exhibition, which were in Wellington, in Rongotai, which was overcome by the beginning of World War II. She did the big frieze above the entranceway there as well. So she was really good at animals. She came from Southland, Invercargill maybe. And when she got to the art school, she said she wanted to, she'd really liked painting horses and cats and things. And Richard Warworks said, he was the principal at that time, he said, well, you won't find any animals here. So she had cats and things like that. She married and so on and so forth. Joan Edgar did this fruit bowl. They had a lot of metal work at the art school. It was sort of arts and crafts stuff, which is exquisite. That's actually a plant, a kakabeak plant, and that's actually a little tiki figure. So it's kind of appropriately or inappropriately using Maori shapes and styles in their work, and the arts and crafts movement did incorporate the local ideas into their work, sort of using the vernacular and so on and so forth. We could spend the night doing something on that. Anyway, another teacher that came out of the school was the Reverend Doris Tootle. She taught at St Margaret's, and she had a large part of her portfolio from the art school. She's very talented, could draw like an angel, honestly. So talented, but she spent her life teaching and encouraged many young women in that field. So that's just a wee look of some of the talent that sort of emerged from this art school, this kind of thing. So I'm going to have a look at Christchurch now and how it sort of developed into this centre of art for this period. So obviously the settlement of New Zealand began with Polynesian people coming to the land. Here in Canterbury, the Waitaha people came to this area first, followed by Ngāti Māmoe and Ngāi Tahu, and we acknowledge the rights of these people to the land, particularly through the Treaty Waitangi. Early European contact came in first in the form of explorers, followed by whalers and sealers who were not very well behaved, and then the flax trade that plied across the Tasman Sea. The Treaty Waitangi was signed by many of the Maori chiefs, including of those Ngāi Tahu chiefs in the South Island in 1840, and most of the South Island was acquired from Maori in the Canterbury land settlement of 1848, when the Crown took 34.5 million acres, more than half the land area mass of the country, for £14,750. So New Zealand was late to be colonised by the British, and by the time New Zealand was settled and the first 4 ships were sailing into the harbour here, the Industrial Revolution was well underway in Britain. Steam engines, gas lighting, the electric motor, and even photography had been invented. And we're pretty lucky, with our history here, because we do actually have photos from pretty much the beginning of settlement, of European settlement here. The first great exhibition opened at Crystal Palace in Hyde Park in 1853, 3 years after the first 4 ships are sailing in. So it sort of just gives you a wee bit of a kind of a shape to what was happening in the Victorian world when Victoria was halfway through her reign at this point in history. Christchurch developed as an Anglican settlement, and there was an intention to build a utopian society with an infrastructure that supported culture, learning and the arts. Canterbury went ahead in a slow, organised way. It didn't have a gold rush in the way that Otago did, which kind of brought the rough element in. It wasn't Auckland, which was also a bit disorganised. It was very organised. So, we sort of, we don't have the first museum and school of art and art society in the country, but they're up there, they're within a few years of those places arriving. So we have this intention of enlightenment. In 1870, the museum was built. Canterbury College was established as a college of the University of New Zealand in 1877, and the art school within this college began 5 years later. The Canterbury Art Society was formed in 1880, and began showing both amateur and professional art at their annual exhibition, and offered prizes for developing artists. Christchurch was also developing as a city, okay, that'll do, with a rising merchant class. The patronage from this new money broadened the art market and allowed artists like Cecil and Elizabeth Kelly to establish careers in the early days of the century. And indeed, the Kellys were part of this rising merchant class. Elizabeth, and she was nee Abbott. She was my sort of disclosure. I'm Janet Abbott. I'm married to Chris Abbott, who is her great nephew. Great nephew. Yeah. Anyway, and the Abbotts were. They'd arrived on the Strathallan in January 1859, along with Enoch Barker, and Abbott and Barker were pioneer nurserymen who were instrumental in Christchurch becoming the garden city. So Barker was the first government gardener, laying out trees in Hagley Park and the 4 avenues, and then planting the Botanic Gardens eventually. Thomas Abbott was a nurseryman who set up Exeter Nursery on 9 acres in Papanui Road and 8 acres in Shirley Road, becoming one of the largest nurseries in the Southern Hemisphere. And they not only brought plum trees into the country, but they also exported ferns to grace the Victorian parlours of England. Elizabeth's father, who was also confusingly called Thomas, became a manager there, and the family lived on the grounds there. And the family fortunes changed when Thomas Abbott the elder died suddenly in 1895, and his wife, who was of the Plymouth Brethren faith, sold the nursery and moved to Australia. So young Thomas, Elizabeth's father, lost his job, his house, and his any expected inheritance just like that. So Elizabeth's father went to work for his former apprentice, Alfred Buxton, and this is the Buxton Rose Catalogue. And Elizabeth designed the cover for it in 1899 while she was at art school. And it shows an Art Nouveau style woman with butterfly wings surrounded by roses growing in Japonism pots. Losing the nursery was a major change for the family. Elizabeth, who'd been studying at the art school, continued with 6 scholarships that she received. And this was also when she realised she would have to make a living from her art, which she proceeded to do with landscapes and portraits in partnership with fellow artist and husband Cecil Kelly. So Cecil, that's an Elizabeth portrait of Cecil. Cecil family were also associated with the growing merchant class. He was the 7th of 10 children of the George and Emma Kelly, born soon after they arrived in New Zealand. He missed being Australian by that much, because the other children had been born along the way, probably mostly in Australia. George Kelly became the manager of Hellenstein Brothers down south, and then in Christchurch, then Wellington, then Auckland. And the company Hellensteins had been set up by Bendix Hellenstein to sell tough clothes to the Otago gold miners. And as the company grew, Cecil's father became manager, and so on and so forth. Cecil stayed in Christchurch when the family moved north, visiting Van der Velden's studio and attending the CSA from 1900 to 1906. So Elizabeth had attended it prior to that, and by the time Cecil got there, she was a junior student assistant teacher for a couple of years there. Van der Velden was one of the greatest influences in art that came to Christchurch in 1890. He was a Dutch master who painted in the romantic realist style of the Hague School. His portraits were often highlighted with golden lights set in a dark space, reminiscent of Rembrandt's portraits. And his philosophy was drawing from nature, and his dark colour palette influenced many of the younger artists in Christchurch. As Sydney Thompson pointed out in a speech at Elizabeth, at the time of Elizabeth's death. In those days, the 1900s, we all painted in a low key, but is that to be wondered at? For Van's paintings was so terribly dark, and so was the work at the Royal Academy and the Salon. So Van der Velden painted, you'll see it in a minute, portraits of old musicians, fishermen, and other fancy titled works. And then in 1891 he discovered Aotearoa and the scenic wonder of the Southern Alps, with the drama of an impending storm, had a Wagnerian grandeur about it. And this appealed to his romantic sensibility, very religious, and this sort of is God's wrath in the landscape. So, you know, sort of the story of Noah, you know, the storm and God's wrath and the storm and the rainbow and all that. No animals involved though. So Van der Velden sold some work in Christchurch to farmers and people that had money, but he also taught, he tried to get a job at the art school, but there was not a position. So he taught in the studio at the bottom of his garden, and he taught Sydney Thompson, Leonard Booth, and some others, but not the Kellys. However, they did visit there, and they did see his work at the Art Society exhibitions. And he was a great influence. So enthused by enthused by Van der Velden's examples and his growing friendship with Elizabeth Cecil, enrolled at the School of Art in 1900, and was taught by people like Alfred Walsh here. And Alfred Walsh was the landscape teacher at that stage. He was a hard taskmaster, and he himself worked on plein air, camping on the Kaikoura coast, for instance, one of his favourite spots, like this work here in 1904. His classes were held out of doors every Tuesday in the first and the third terms, so they missed the winter term. Figure drawing was also taught at the School of Art. Drawing from the antique involved copying nuances of light and shade from the cast. So they had statues cast from Michelangelo's David. If you're a junior, you got like the eye of Michelangelo's David, or the ear, or the nose, or the mouth of Michelangelo's David. And then they worked their way up to a full head and then a bigger statue. But they could draw with a pencil like a photo, because they put in their 10,000 hours. So it was a thoroughly academic training in figure and landscape painting, tempered with the Hague School influence from Van der Velden, and that's what shapes Christchurch art in those early decades. We can possibly see it. Oh, there they are out in the painting class, out in the landscape round the Avon River. Mostly women, a lot of women at the art school. So this is Cecil Kelly's The Veteran, old Scottish veteran with maybe some whiskey there, would you think? Cecil Kelly doesn't paint many portraits, but in the early period, up to about 1910, he does paint a few, and they are of good quality. So that looks a little bit like, say, Van der Velden's Old Jack, for instance, at Dunedin Public Art Gallery. And Elizabeth painted something similar as well. And I do wonder whether it's the same model. You know, look at that. And keep an eye on the nose. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Anyway, Elizabeth's response to Van der Velden was with the old clarinet player, the old musician, and the old fisherman. And she also painted peasant-style women in white caps or bonnets. It was, as a woman painting in a studio on her own, she couldn't really have a male model. She did paint some older men, but I think they were models at the art school. But she actually had to either sit with a woman in her studio, but she couldn't have a man in her studio. Even when she was married, throughout her career, I mean, she painted Cecil a few times. The critics of the day were harsh about the way she painted men. She couldn't, as a woman artist, she couldn't capture the nuances of masculinity or something ridiculous. Anyway, so she painted mainly women because it was just easier. And here she, possibly a self-portrait. If it is a self-portrait, she's tidied herself up a wee bit. Chin, she does actually have a naturally long chin, and I think it's a little bit less, and I doubt that her eyes are that blue. But jury's out on that one. Ken thinks it's a self-portrait. CSA Hanging Committee. Can you see a woman there? Right. So in this scene of the growing Christchurch art scene, Cecil and Elizabeth set about making their careers as professional artists. Cecil was employed as a junior teacher in 1907, gaining a senior post in 1919 after World War I, teaching landscape and still life painting for the next 28 years. Elizabeth started painting portraits of young women with fancy titles, such as Winter, Youth and Diana, so not the girl's name, but sort of a descriptive title. And those works were shown at the Society of Art, demonstrating her talent. And both Diana and Youth were purchased by the Art Society. The Canterbury Society of Arts began in 1880 and provided an opportunity for these artists to exhibit their work. They also purchased artworks which form the basis of the Christchurch Art Gallery collection when they built the Robert McDougall Gallery in 1932. I've looked at the committee of the Art Society, and I'm just really interested in the fact that Margaret Stoddard was on the committee there for a while. So for the first 3 years there were no women on the council. For the next 17 years there were women on the council, up to 5 women on the council, including Margaret Stoddard and others, and I think they were quite useful. But then there's this 27-year period where there are no women on the council whatsoever. And then from 1928 again, you've got women on the council, starting with Margaret Stoddard again, who stays on it till she dies. And Elizabeth Kelly's on the council in the late 30s. So if you have any ideas about why that might happen, I'd love to know. We've suggested a few naughty things, but we don't know why women were excluded for 27 years. Certainly women made up half of the working members of the society, and in 1904 Elizabeth was elected as a working member, and she remained a member until her death 42 years later. During that time she exhibited over 286 works. You were allowed 8 works per year, and mostly often showing that quota. And then they exhibited at the 4 main art societies around the country in succession. So CSA in March, the Auckland Society of Arts in May, the Wellington NZAFA in September, and Otago Art Society in November. And that system gave artists a chance to tour works that hadn't sold through the country. Cecil similarly became a working member in 1904, and he exhibited for 50 years because he lived 8 years longer. And he also showed works at all the art societies around the country. Cecil was elected onto the council in 1912 and stayed there till his death in 1954. So that's the difference between like a man and a woman of similar ilk. Sydney Thompson, that had the highly rated overseas experience and spent about half his life in Concarneau in France. He started earlier on the committee in 1899 and served periodically on the council when he was back in New Zealand for a reasonable length of time, and he was also president and vice president. So women got the least chance, men that stayed in Christchurch got the next most chance, and if you had overseas experience they thought that you were pretty good and you got more opportunities. So there's that kind of thing going on there. I'm just going to watch my time. I might just. So critics in Christchurch, Art Society shows were reported and reviewed in the papers of the day. Early reviewers were largely unattributed. Then in 1920 we get Professor James Shelley, and we had Dr. Lester in the press. So they were kind of competing. Dr. Lester knew more people. He was more kind of involved. James Shelley came from overseas. He was involved in theatre circles, and he gave lectures. Came over to take over the education department at Canterbury College, but he gave lectures in art history for many years there. From the 50s, a more critical approach to art developed across other publications, and we have people like Charles Brash and Alan Curnow, Betty's husband, and the son, Winston, and others of those Auckland people. So pretty much from the 1950s, it's a pretty northern Auckland-based criticism of art. Yeah. So that's that. Yeah. Patronage and galleries. The CSA exhibitions catered for many pockets, and it seems that the Kellys knew this market well. For instance, in 1912, Elizabeth offered 3 portraits. Betrothed and Dawn were £50, Diana was 10 guineas, and 5 landscapes, different sizes, were priced from 2 to 6 guineas. So even if you had a small amount of money, well, not small in those days, but you could buy art. It's difficult to know who bought the landscapes, but a wide range of Cantabrians provided early patronage of the arts. The records of purchases from CSA shows have been lost in the last few years. Someone threw them out, and I haven't forgiven them yet. And a list of 105 people who sat for their portraits by Elizabeth give us some idea of who commissioned art of that type. They came from a large social group. Bill Waltop and others came from their social circle. The Jewish families of Christchurch were also patrons of the arts, and it's an unfortunate time to talk about Jewish people, but anyway, we'll give it a go. A Jewish family were appreciated for the goods and services that they provide in a colonial society, like rugged workwear like Levi Strauss and Hellenstein's. The Bellins family owned hotels and breweries. The Bellins family arrived on the goldfields of, they came from the goldfields of Ballarat in Australia, came to Hokitika and then Thames, where they're rumoured to have found gold. Bernard Bellin started manufacturing lemonade, aerated water, in 1878. And the Ballin boys became part of the Linwood Rugby Club and Taylor's Mistake Surf Lifesaving Club. Always generous, they were particularly popular when they brought the brewery and brought free beer to the annual events and such like. Anyway, the Ballin families took a different approach to being accepted in society, and they had their portraits painted, and they were shown around the country. And then those portraits went to London, to the Royal Academy, and came back. Didn't go to the salon, and we have them in the collection because the family have donated them. We've reached 7 o'clock. Have we got a limit? Should I keep going? Yep. Okay. Another factor in the Christchurch arts scene was the international. Oh, there's one of the Ballin ladies. She married Bolton, and she became Sybil Bolton. And there's a certain statuesque quality about her, would you say? And there's a sister. Do any of you know about the International Exhibition in Christchurch? Yeah. So 1906, 1907 was a time when New Zealand went from a colony to a dominion. To celebrate this, we had this great exhibition in Christchurch. That's Hagley Park. This is Kilmore Street coming down here into the main entranceway here. And that's Victoria Lake there, just to give you a kind of a thing. And they built this huge building. Like, I mean, the original Great Exhibition in London, they built Crystal Palace with, you know, prefabricated iron, steel and glass, like a giant glass house, over the top of the trees. It's amazing. Here, they did something different. They milled, goodness knows how much timber on the west coast. Have I got some figures? Remu milled on the west coast formed the structure. 16 acres of Remu flooring was used, and a special rail link was built across Hagley Park from Matai Street to bring in the materials in some of the larger exhibitions. The British art was of such high value that it was housed in a separate fireproof building at the back. And that's looking down. So that's the art gallery. Can you see that up there? So that's this is all like timber, so it could go up in smoke, but that was built in brick. Of the 12 rooms, 3 were given to colonial art section and showed 355 works. We've recently had an exhibition of some of the works that the British works that were bought by the art gallery, Christchurch Art Gallery, or have been donated, have found their way into the collection, shall we say. There was a particular style of art that was, you know, seen to be the type of art that would improve the standard in this colonial place. The exhibition also provided local artists a chance to exhibit their works to a wider audience. And Elizabeth Kelly, for instance, who was Elizabeth Abbott at that stage, showed 5 works in the colonial section. The sales from the British section totalled over £15,000, and many of those works were bought by New Zealand and Australian art galleries, and you can see some of those in their collections. So starting around, this is another kind of influence, kind of, there's the British art section, you can kind of see the style there, that lovely work of Henley there. Not much modernism happening, and this is 1906, and, you know, Cubism, first early Cubism, 1908 to 1910, classical Cubism, Picasso and Braque, 1910 to 1912, you know, all that stuff's happening in Paris, but it's considered to be not relevant.